I don't know about you guys, but being a gamer in this past decade's been pretty neat. I mean, there've been so many great games to where it's almost impossible to keep up with everything unless you're some kind of whiz kid like my dad, and despite all kinds of jabronis swearing up and down that home consoles were dead, they're not only hanging in there, but they're actually stronger than ever. But as awesome as this past decade's been for actual gameplay though, one big downside is that video game companies are greasier than ever, which you could blame on the power of the internet, but it really just comes down to developers being shady, because when used responsibly, the internet can make games up to 1,000 times better. What kinds of shady business am I talking about? Well, sit back in your third favorite YouTube viewing chair, stop googling pictures of Barbra Streisand's house, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the world's least dangerous horse jockey, CameronAllOneWord, to tell you the 12 biggest gaming scams in the past decade. Number 12. The Soulja Game. In 2018, the rapper Soulja Boy founded his own tech company, Soulja Watch, and then dropped a bombshell on the gaming industry with the announcement of a brand new console called, you guessed it, the Soulja Game, which was basically him just reselling bootleg consoles from China with hundreds of pirated ROMs on it at a heavily inflated price. Obviously, it was illegal as all hell, but since China's pretty frig, no one's gonna tell him to stop. However, Soulja Boy, on the other hand, never lived in China, but apparently because he's a genius, he thought he could get away with this scam by pretty much being a middleman for the Chinese website AliExpress. And, well, to his credit, he was able to somehow stay out of trouble for about 2 weeks, which is 13 days longer than I expected, and during those weeks, he arrogantly boasted about how foolproof his plan was, and even tripled down with more bootleg consoles. The only reason why a scam so outrageous barely made the list, though, is because you'd have had to have been a complete idiot to buy one of these things for any other reason than a joke. And besides, nobody ever actually lost any money over this, seeing as how none of the consoles actually shipped out, even though Mad Little Pixel bought one through AliExpress and just lied about it being a Soulja game. And yes, I am only calling him out because I wish I thought of the idea first. Number 11. Digital now, physical later. The great debate between physical and digital has been going on ever since the Lincoln administration, and it's probably not going to end anytime soon. Personally, I prefer physical, but if you're a small indie developer who's just trying to make ends meet, then there's no shame in only releasing a game digitally, and should these kinds of games become popular someday, then I'll even go an ass hair further and say that there's nothing wrong with re-releasing them later on physically. So why am I including this on the list? Well, because sometimes big-name developers like to take advantage of fans' acceptance towards this practice by first releasing their games digitally only, and then, without giving anybody a heads up, coming out with physicals later on. Because they know damn well there's a lot of people out there who'll buy digital if they have to, but then buy the same game again if a physical's made. Some prime examples of this are Final Fantasy VII and 8 on the Switch, New Super Luigi U on the Wii U, and most notably for me, Sonic Mania. A lot of people like to lie to themselves and pretend that Sega somehow saw this game as some kind of an experiment and that they weren't too sure they could justify the financial risk of putting it onto a physical disc or cartridge. But seeing as how they actually did have a physical release with a digital download, it's pretty obvious that they were lying, not to mention the fact that it's a friggin' Sonic game. I mean, even if it sucks, people are still gonna buy it. If I'm being honest though, I'm actually glad they waited to make physicals for this so that the DLC could be immortalized along with the rest of the game, which is why it barely even made the list at all. But if the reason for holding off on a physical release really was to prevent DLC from being lost after the apocalypse destroys the internet, then it would have been nice if they at least told us physicals were coming. Instead though, Sega thought, hey, let's only give people the option to buy this highly popular game digitally, and then collectors who already bought the game will buy it again once we make physicals for it. I know nobody was forced to repurchase these kinds of games, but if they were released digitally and were at least given a heads up that physicals were coming later on, then I'm pretty goddamn sure that people would have waited. And to be fair to Nintendo though, they actually did give us a heads up when releasing New Super Luigi Bros. U, but it didn't help me a whole lot when butthole GameStop took my money for a pre-order of that game and gave me a digital download code instead that they refused to give me a refund on. Speaking of GameStop though. Number 10. ThinkGeek scalping Super Nintendo Classic Editions. Alright, let's be real here. GameStop could be on this list for like 800 different reasons. In fact, they're actually going to be on it again later. But if I'm being honest, most of GameStop's shadiness requires people to agree to stupid deals in the first place. But one thing I can't let slide is that time that ThinkGeek, an online store owned by GameStop, knew damn well how badly people were fiending for Nintendo's classic consoles. So rather than selling the inventory they had at retail price, they decided to bundle them together with other crap they had lying around that they couldn't sell. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they weren't even discounting any of this other crap either. True, much like GameStop's trade-in deals, I know a lot of people could have just not bought these bundles, but when it was technically a better deal than what you'd find on eBay at the time, some people felt like they didn't have a choice. And it'd be one thing if scalpers were doing this, but for a company who's expected to honor retail price to use a loophole like this just to make a few extra bucks only further explains why GameStop's probably going out of business in the near future. But while we're on the topic of mini consoles, though. Number 9. The mini consoles made by AtGames. Mini consoles are pretty badass, but for whatever reason, Sega thought it'd be a good idea to put the jabronis at AtGames in charge of designing their classic retro consoles. For those of you who've never played one of these things, all you need to know is that a third of the sound was missing, the controllers were cheaper than my wife's spray tan, and the emulation was awful. I know releasing a bad product's more of a botch than a scam, but I couldn't help but put this here because 1, making a classic console with preloaded games shouldn't have been that difficult, 2, AtGames just kept making new models of these and they all sucked big fat snake eggs, and 3, the game selections on these were actually pretty good, so it was easy for people to be tricked into buying this hot garbage. I mean, even I ended up getting one, and I literally returned it within like 5 minutes of playing it. The PlayStation Classic does deserve an honorable mention in the mini console scam category, but they did eventually lower the price to $20, and as disappointing as that thing was, it was still decent at that price and a hell of a lot better than anything AtGames ever mustered up. Number 8. On-disc DLC. DLC is a little bit of a slippery slope. It's awesome that great games can become even better by adding more content later on, but the problem is that instead of having extra content on day one that you can unlock by playing the game, many developers decided to make the consumer pay for that content instead. Honestly, I wouldn't have a problem with this if you could unlock extras by completing difficult tasks with the option to pay for them instead, but when a game has the content right there ready to go on day one and expects you to spend even more money on the game, that's pretty lame. Number 7. Incomplete games on physical media. I know this might sound crazy in 2020, but before the internet, video games weren't sent to stores until they were actually finished. However, it was pretty common for games to slip through the cracks with some glitches here and there, and when that did happen, the glitches kind of became a part of the game's history, and if they were bad enough, the games were just simply doomed. Thanks to the internet though, developers have the ability to fix flaws that they might have missed via patches, which I'm all for, but the problem is that most companies just see this as an excuse to send unfinished games to retail, with the idea of just making people download the rest of the game later. Most people have the internet these days, so it's really not that big of a deal, but when you combine this issue with the fact that there's assloads of compilations being sold with some of the content included on the disc or cartridge with a download code for the rest that can only be used one time, then that's when I'm ready to raise some hell, because this issue would have absolutely never been accepted anywhere outside of video games. I mean, imagine buying the VHS box set to Full House, but it only came with one season and a download code for the rest that you can only use on one VCR at one time. I'm pretty sure there'd be some pretty crazy riots, and I don't think the National Guard would even try to stop them. To the best of my knowledge, this all started with the Sly Cooper collection on the Vita, but then it continued on with the Spyro trilogy and pretty much everything Capcom puts on the Switch. And I know that Switch cartridges with higher storage cost more to make than Blu-rays, but when both Mega Man Legacy collections are less than 8 GB combined, then you know Capcom's just trying to take the consumer's ability to sell their games away from them. If publishers only wanted to release their games digitally, then I wouldn't call it a scam one bit, even though I would prefer competent physical releases, because selling physical copies of incomplete games is essentially just selling a digital copy anyway. Some people are going to say that this is proof of physical games becoming obsolete, but it's only becoming obsolete because developers are abusing the internet. And I know a lot of people complain about physical game boxes being straight up sold with nothing but download codes, but if you ask me, I still think physicals with half the game are actually worse because of how misleading they are. Especially since most of the Switch games that are just download codes usually don't come with a Switch tax. But now that I've said the word Switch tax though, let's move on to... Number 6. The abuse of the Switch tax. So based on everything I've read online, 8GB Switch cartridges seem to cost about the same as Blu-rays, or at least it did when the Switch launched anyway. But cartridges that hold more than that start to become more and more expensive, so that means some of the higher end games need to cost a little bit more to come to the little hybrid that could, and in most cases, I wouldn't call that a scam. However, sometimes companies see that others are getting away with charging more for their Switch games, and then they decide, what the hell, let's do it too, and then release games that are more expensive on the Switch because they know damn well people don't mind paying for it. But the only reason people don't mind paying extra is because they naively trust that no developer would abuse this, and instead just blame Nintendo for the cartridges being so expensive, even when that's not always the case. I mean, look at LA Noire, for instance. I'm sure a game like Doom probably took a lot of work to get running on the Switch, but for an Xbox 360 port from 2011 to cost $10 more on the Switch was absolutely ludicrous, especially when you had to download a big portion of the game anyway. The overall file size to the full Switch version of that game is 29GB, and if you bought a physical for an inflated price, then you'd have to download 14GB of it anyway, meaning that they paid for the 16GB cartridge for no reason. But if the game's unplayable without the download anyway, then why not just use the 8GB or even 2GB cartridge? Or better yet, just sell the game digitally or even a box with a download code, because at least then there wouldn't have been a Switch tax. Any way you look at it, Rockstar either used a more expensive cartridge to make the game cost more for no reason, or they decided to take advantage of it, but the real issue is with Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Layer costing $10 more on the Switch than it does on other consoles, which is absolutely ridiculous since the game's only 5GB, and while the graphics look completely fine, they're not something that'd be challenging for even the Switch to run. Unfortunately though, Playtonic knew damn well how nostalgic people are about Rare and Nintendo, and that the Switch version would probably be most people's preference, and unless somebody explains how it makes sense that this game costs $10 more on the Switch, then I fully believe that this is a dick move on their part. Number 5. GameStop opening Xenoblade copies and reselling them as new. Long story short, GameStop was the only store in North America to sell Xenoblade Chronicles for the Wii, and not only did they charge me $5 extra just because I didn't pre-order the game, but when the game's aftermarket price went up to around $90, GameStop decided to capitalize on the demand. And what better way to do that than to sell all the boxes of unsold games they had lying around at the warehouses? Brand new copies of the game probably would have sold for a lot of money at the time, but since I'm sure it was probably illegal to sell them for more than retail price, GameStop instead told their employees to open the games and sell them as used for $90 just so they could make some extra money. Sure, it might have made them a little extra cash in the short term, but it certainly didn't earn them any brownie points with the consumers in the long run. Friggin' dicks. Number 4. Rushed games that are never fixed. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes AAA games are given deadlines that are so strict that even if the game's a complete mess, it's gonna be sent out anyway with the idea that it could just be fixed later on like I mentioned earlier. But what makes this point way worse than the one I mentioned earlier is that at least sometimes games are completed with patches by the time the release date comes, or at least shortly after anyway. Meanwhile though, there's the case of the WWE 2K games where the developers have less than a year to make an entirely new game, so what happens in most cases like this is that games are either fixed through patches way later on, or sometimes never even fully at all. Number 3. Microtransactions. The first time I've ever actually noticed microtransactions in a game I was playing was in Bravely Default for the 3DS, where you could basically pay money to make the battles way easier, which is lame as hell, but honestly, if you chose to ignore it, it really didn't negatively affect the game in any way, even though things got pretty tough in some of the battles in the second half of the game. Aside from that, though, I've never actually played many games with microtransactions in them because I think they're pretty lame, but even though most microtransactions do require people to be stupid enough to pay to win in the first place, the worst part about them is that they ruin a lot of games that would have otherwise been good. Not to mention the fact that the effort it takes to make a game designed around making people spend money could have been better spent on making games that are just plain fun. Number 2. Loot boxes. In case you're lucky enough to not know what loot boxes are, they're essentially a specific kind of microtransaction, but this really deserves its own entry because at least with normal microtransactions, you know what you're gonna get, as opposed to loot boxes where you're basically paying for a chance to get something you want. This might be a little controversial, but honestly, I don't see this as any more of a form of gambling than Pokemon cards are, and even though I do think it can be addictive, I honestly don't think it should be illegal just because I don't like them. Because if you ban loot boxes, then you're gonna have to ban a lot of other stuff as well. However, it's absolutely still a ripoff, and no developer should ever even think about using them again, because all they really do is ruin games. It'd be a lot less ridiculous if it only consisted of cosmetic stuff that you don't really need, or if there was a way you could buy specific things that you wanted, but when games like Star Wars Battlefront 2 makes it take dozens of hours to unlock something that you might get at random by paying money, then I can only classify it as a scam. Number 1. Paywalls. This is basically two of the previous entries being combined into one thing, incomplete games being sold in microtransactions. Paywalls are the only way to get content that's essential for getting the full experience out of a game by paying real-life money. The worst example of this that I know of is when you had to pay to get the true ending to Azura's Wrath, but to me, games where paywalls are the most prevalent are in the fighting and racing genres. Extra fighter stages, cars, and racetracks being sold as DLC later on can be incredible, don't get me wrong, but for games like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, where most of the new characters are $8 each, are pretty lame when there's barely any new characters in the base game. I know Smash Ultimate's charging $6 per character, but the base game's pretty goddamn loaded, and even then, the bonus characters are all from third parties and require royalties and whatnot. But don't think I'm just gonna blindly defend Smash Bros though, because while I think Smash Ultimate's probably one of the best games ever, Smash 4's DLC was a little bit of a dick move. To be fair, the base game was still pretty loaded in its own right, but whereas the season pass for Ultimate cost $25, buying everything in Smash 4 ended up costing over $200 for 7 fighters if you wanted them in both versions. I'm sure making the same game for 2 different platforms was probably a nightmare for Sakurai, which is why I wanted to quit the series at the time, but they really should have had a package deal for all the DLC. Admittedly though, I haven't played too many games within the past 10 years that lock essential content behind paywalls, but even one time's enough for me to consider it the worst scam of the decade. But anyway, what do you think the biggest scams of the past decade were? I'm sure there's plenty that I missed, and I know there's a lot I could have elaborated on more, so feel free to mention something that I missed in the comments, or something you felt like I was too hard on, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. But let me tell you, if there's two people who certainly aren't scams in the gaming industry in any way, then it would definitely be today's patrons of the day, Austin Garcia and Ninja Robot. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes in the mail and other wacky rewards. And if you want to make a cameo, then send pictures or videos of you rocking any FU Game Crew merch like these legendary human beings you see before you. As always, like and share this video anywhere on the internet to help this channel grow. And if you want to prove that you're not down with registered sex offenders, then go ahead and press the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's CameronAllOneWord, and I'll be back with more videos soon.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.